So if you are new to React, right, you may hear that on top of learning React, you have to learn Redux, and you have to pick a CSS and JS solution, and you have to do server-side rendering, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you have to do it all at the same time while learning React, right? And it can be completely overwhelming. And React is just a UI library, so you need to pick a library for fetching data, for managing state, and all these other things in order to create your full stack, your full framework. And the question is, like, how do you know what to pick if you've never used it before? So actually, how many people here have developed in React before? You raise your hand. Okay, great. So most of us in here. Awesome. So what I want to do is I want to break up the different libraries into categories, and I'm going to order them in the way that I believe folks should learn them first and what you should prioritize learning. And then within each category, I'll list the different options of libraries and then give my preference for which library that you should pick. But before we get into the ecosystem, everything around React, let me just quickly chat about React. So for those of for those of you getting started, my suggestion always is to learn React and to learn it really, really well, which might sound like an obvious statement, but it's really important to focus on just React by itself. So learning how to maintain state properly and leverage the virtual DOM or the reconciler, because if you're coming from an MVC type model, right, the one-way data flow may seem counterintuitive. So after you get those basics, though, then we've got to keep up with all the latest features here, right, because React continues to evolve. So there are lots of different features that have come out since version 16 of React, including hooks, which everyone was excited about, which came out in .8, which has completely changed how we develop our components. And then there's also concurrent mode. For those of you who haven't heard of it, it was announced at ReactConf last October, which is going to hopefully make our apps even more performant. But it hasn't even been released. It's just experimental, so you could check it out if you're interested, but you can definitely wait on that. So if you want to learn more about React components, though, Catherine, right after me, will be talking about how to create a component library from scratch. So we'll get to know more of those details about React itself. But before I continue, can I get everyone to stand up again? Can I get everyone to stand up? Okay. So what I like to do during my talks is I like to warm us all up. So we're going to do 10 squats just like this, for real. Okay, so if you don't want to do it, we'll do it all together. If you don't want to do it, you don't have to. You could totally sit down if you don't want to or whatever. But it's just to get the blood flowing and such, because it's early in the morning. And for me, since I'm from the West Coast, it's really, really early in the morning. Okay, so let's do 10 squats together, okay? We'll count them out together. Here we go. Ready? 1. Yep, we're doing it. 2, 3. Keep going. 4. 5, halfway there, 6, 7, 8, woo, feel the burn, 9, and 10. Awesome job, great job, have a seat. Woo. Okay. Way to go everyone. Okay, so to formally introduce myself, my name is Ben Ilegbodu. I'm a Christian, a husband, and a father. Here's my family. That's my wife, Rashida. We've been married for over 9 years now, and we have 3 kids. Oldest daughter is Simone. She is 5.5. Second daughter, Avery. She is 3 years old. And our son, youngest son, Asher, will be 11 months next week or so. And we're still trying to teach him how to smile in photos. But we're working on it. I'm also a Google developer expert and Microsoft MVP in web technologies. So I just recently started at a company called Stitch Fix as a front-end architect, which I'm super duper excited about. It's been about 6 weeks, so I'm still learning everything, but having lots of fun. For those of you who haven't heard about Stitch Fix, we're an online personal styling service. So we take the power of machine learning and algorithms, we pair it with a human stylist and are able to recommend and pick out clothes for you on demand, and we send it to you whenever you would like. And we're also hiring. Our headquarters is in San Francisco, but we have half of our engineering team is spread across the whole country as remote engineers. So you can work wherever you want if you want to join us. And in fact, one of my colleagues, Ross, right there on second row, he lives here in DC and works with us. So just wanted to point that out. Oh yeah, wanted to congratulate y'all on the championship. Congrats. So that was just, fun. Anyway, okay, enough about me and the gnats, I guess. Let's talk about this React ecosystem. So I'm going to be covering a whole bunch of stuff. I'm just going to put it out there. And I'm not going to be able to go into any detail of any given library, but I want to kind of talk about everything that's out there so that you can take some things away and go and do more detailed research. So I've already tweeted out a link to the slides if you want to follow along or if you want to make sure you have them. So if you go to my Twitter profile, Ben MVP, you'll find a link there. Or also I have a bit.ly link that's behind me, but it's behind me, so you can't quite see it. So first, probably the biggest issue with React in the beginning was tooling. Because in order to get set up, you had to figure out all these different things that you had to use, and there was just so much choice in the area. For instance, you had to figure out which bundler you're going to use. And there's 6 different options here, Webpack being the most popular of them. And then you had to figure out how you were going to run your commands. Are you going to pick grunt or gulp, or are you just going to go with npm scripts? And then you had to figure out how are you going to set up ESLint, or are you going to pick flow or TypeScript for type checking? Now TypeScript has won that battle. And in the end, the React team came up with Create React App to kind of give us 0 build configuration so that we didn't have to worry about all those things. You just run the command and then you're able to start building your commands, building your components because it has all of that infrastructure in there for you. So it has Babel already configured for you, Webpack. It has ESLint in there, TypeScript support if you want that, CSS modules, all those sorts of things you can kind of leverage in there. You can configure more and more if you want to do some special things. But at some point, if you just have some bespoke stuff that you want to do, then you can just eject and manage it all yourself that way. And it'll also generate a production build for you that's optimized if you just run the build command. So I have a whole bunch of other tooling resources that you can check out. Some of them are pretty cool there. But I wanted to move on to styling, okay? So you have your UI, you're able to build it, it's functional, but that's half the battle. You also have to make it look nice in order for it to have the full user experience. So there are 5 different ways that I can think of that you can handle styling. So the first 3, global CSS, component CSS, and CSS modules, all deal with CSS, obviously. They have CSS in the title. Global CSS is like using something like Foundation or Bootstrap. So some other entity is creating all your CSS for you, and you just reference it in your component. Component CSS is just importing a CSS snippet, so it's always tied to your component, and that CSS will never get included if you don't use the component. And then CSS modules is pretty cool because you don't have to worry about namespacing your CSS anymore. So the classes you can use in the component like root or isActive, and you can just write that plain, and then the CSS module system will namespace and hash the classes properly so that there are no namespace collisions in your component. So those who decide to go with inline styles are they're like in the screw CSS camp. And they're tired of dealing with specificity wars and unexpected cascading, and they put bang important on everything to make sure it gets implied, right? So, or they're dealing with wanting to have dynamic styles based upon their props and such. So inline styles really became popular when React Native came out because everything was styled with inline styles. There was no CSS with React Native. But the problem with inline styles is that it only supports what inline styles support in general. So you can't do things like pseudo classes, like hover, for instance, something simple like hover, and other pseudo classes. You can't do media queries. You can't do keyframe animations. All those sorts of things are kind of problems with inline styles. So they're beneficial in that your styles are in JavaScript, so they can be really tied to your props and your configuration, but they have many drawbacks. So that's where CSS and JS popped in the landscape to try to get the best of both worlds between CSS and inline styles. So there are a number of different libraries in that space, Emotion being one of the latest ones, but also really popular because it's kind of learned from all of the other libraries and it's created a really flexible API. It can do a lot of the things that the other ones can do. And so my suggestion is if you're starting out, I would suggest starting out with component CSS because it's familiar in terms of writing CSS. And then you can import the CSS snippet that you've written. But as you start bumping into some of the problems with CSS in general, then you can go into a CSS solution. I suggest picking Emotion for handling that. And then once you're familiar with Emotion, then you can just continue to use it from then on out. OK, so then I have a bunch of styling resources that you can take a look at there. So then next, I want to move into the libraries that are great for SPAs. And there are two main subcategories of that. The first one being data fetching. So your favorite batteries included framework would have some mechanism for fetching, making AJAX requests, right? But since React is just the UI layer, you have to pick one yourself. So there are two main options here. The native fetch API, and then a library called Axios. Axios actually existed before React existed. It was meant to be a jQuery alternative for making API calls. And you could use jQuery, I guess, in React for making API calls, $.get. But then you'll probably end up using jQuery for other things you probably shouldn't be using it for. So it's just best to just leave jQuery alone. So either one have their benefits. So obviously the native fetch API is native to the browser, so it's just there. But IE doesn't support it, so you'll have to polyfill it. Axios is nice because it has some helper methods like .get and .post for it to be easier to make fetch calls, as well as it has support for canceling API calls as well. So I've always just used the native API, fetch API, and haven't had any problems with that. And then they're both promise-based, so once promises are able to be canceled, then the fetch API will also be able to be canceled as well. So there are some additional readings you can take a look at. And then the second subcategory is routing, because you want to keep your UI in sync with the URL. And there are two main options here, React Router and Reach Router. React Router being the most popular and the biggest. So Reach Router, they're actually built by the same people. Reach Router was like a rethink of how routing should work, trying to be accessible first. So when you switch routes in a section of your UI changes, what Reach Router will do, it will give focus to that section of the page, whatever it is, when the route happens. And it does some smart things around relative links and how you write your routes and stuff. So it's actually a pretty nice API. So in the future, though, they're going to be merging back into one. And they're going to be merging back into one as React Router. So maybe V6 or V7 of React Router, they'll come together and it'll be a hooks-based API. So what they suggest is that if you have a couple of routes, or at least routes that you can migrate all in one commit, go with React Router, because that's a Reach Router, rather, because that's the new API will be very similar to Reach Router. But if you have a lot of routes that you will need to migrate over time, stick with React Router, because the new version that's coming up will be backwards compatible, so you'll be able to migrate your routes there over time. So there are some links for routing. Okay, let's keep going. So let's talk about forms here. And forms are difficult, right? And not just in React, but like in general, because there are so many different rules or requirements that we have for forms. Like we might have a tiny form, which is just a login form with email and password, or we might have this big, complicated, nested forms like a checkout form, or we have shipping address form and billing and all those sorts of things. And then we have like different rules for our form validation as well. Like we have synchronous validation, like regular expressions, or we have async validation where we want to verify this email has been used. Sometimes we want the form at the top, or sometimes we want the form warnings interspersed with the elements. Sometimes we want to show the warnings when they when they blur the field, or sometimes we want to show the warnings when they submit the whole form. Like there's all these different rules around warnings, and we want to make sure our form is dirty or clean and all those sorts of things. So there are form state managers to help us with that. Redux form is the biggest and the oldest. It's been around the longest. But the problem with Redux form is in its name. It needs Redux, right? And I haven't talked about Redux as something you should have to learn yet. And it was really big in terms as a library as well. So final form and Formic, both of those were responses to the problem that they needed, that Redux form needed Redux. Because now you have people using Redux form who didn't need Redux, and they're writing improper Redux, and yeah, it's just not a good situation. So final form was written by the same person who wrote Redux form, so it has a very similar API, but doesn't depend on Redux, and it has a plug-in architecture, which is also the same as Formic as well. They're built at the same time and actually have very similar APIs and capabilities that they can do. They're very much feature parity, so you can't really go wrong with either one. I've used Redux form myself, so I will continue to use final form because it has a API that I'm used to. That really you can't go wrong with either one. Okay. Then there's testing, right? So no one really likes to write tests. We'll be honest, right? We like having tests, or like somebody else writing the test, so that when we bump packages or we're refactoring a component, you can run tests and feel easy and can sleep at night. But we have to be able to write tests. And there are a number of different kind of levels at which we can write tests. So there is Cypress, Cypress.io, which enables us to run browser-based end-to-end tests. And it's not Selenium or WebDriver if you're used to have to deal with those. It's actually written in JavaScript, and it's super duper fast. And in fact, it can be used as a development environment because it will rerun your tests every time you change your component. So let's say you need to click this thing to pop up a modal, and that's what you're developing on. You could write a test to do that, and then every time you make changes, it will click this thing, click that thing, and show up the modal, and then you can keep developing in that way. And then when you're done, you have a happy path test already written for you. So that's pretty cool. And then there's Enzyme, which has existed basically since React came out, developed by Airbnb for unit testing your components without needing a browser, which at the time was just like mind-blowing, being able to write UI tests without needing a browser and how quick they were able to run. Enzyme has a jQuery-like interface with lots of different methods you can use to interact and query your components. But the problem with the interface is that you can do way too much with it. So in the end, you start testing implementation details. It's really easy to do that, and you can shoot yourself in the foot because when you refactor the component, It does the same thing, but then your tests start failing. So React testing library was a response to that problem, and also trying to encourage us to write tests that focus more along the lines of what our users are interacting with their app, as opposed to how we decided to implement our app. So React testing library is more in the integration level of tests, and wants us to test how our users use our app. So even something like a helper component that's there, you wouldn't necessarily need to test that. You want to test slices of your app, and the helper component itself is an implementation detail. So you could still use React testing library to unit test, especially if you have a component library itself and you want to make sure that this button component does what it needs to do. But it's really geared towards integration tests, like how multiple components come together to work. But luckily for us, we have Matt, who's going to be talking about testing in React and using React testing library so that we can write effective non-brittle tests. So that'll be coming up after the break. If you're interested in that, make sure you check that out. And I have tons of resources on tests and videos and stuff for you there. Okay, so at this point, we have focused on React, obviously. We've done tooling, we've done styling, we've done SPAs, forms, and tests, okay? And at this point, we have like everything we need to create production level apps. Like this is all you need. And you could ship to production and feel confident in what you've done. But there's more to cover, a couple of more things that are more geared towards larger scale apps that I want to share. The first one being, of course, everybody's favorite topic, Redux, and app state management. So Redux has gotten a lot of backlash lately because I think a lot of people were using and reaching for Redux when they really didn't need to reach for it. And there's lots of boilerplate that is not serving them in any kind of way. So you really need an app state management when you have lots of data that multiple different components need to update, and you have lots of different events triggering those updates and such. And people were using it to maintain UI states, like whether this thing is toggled on and off, and just lots of problems with that. So there are a number of different options in this field, MobX and Redux being kind of two sides of the same coin and how they work. So Redux is all about having immutability, and that you can never mutate your state. If an action happens, you have to make a copy of that state, make the changes, and then submit the changes, and your UI will update. Whereas MobX, on the other hand, is that you have your state, and then you make mutations to it just like you normally would. So you would push on it, or you would index into something and change the value. And it uses observables in order to understand that the object has changed, and then as a result, it will update the UI that way. And then there's something XState, which actually has been around for a while and is now recently being used with Redux. It's a little bit more complicated. It's basically you create your own state machine, and you model all of your different states, all of the different events that will trigger changes of those states. And the purpose there is that if you can fully model your whole state and the changes, you won't get into mutually exclusive states, which sometimes happens. So then any changes of the state will then be communicated to the UI. But it's quite possible now with custom hooks and the context API, we could do a lot of the things that we used to reach for Redux or some of these other libraries instead. So the context API helping us get data to multiple different components at the same time without having to do prop drilling, and then the hooks or custom hooks in order to be able to update the data as you need it. So, though Dylan later will be talking about Redux, thankfully for us, and specifically event-driven Redux, which is a different mindset of how to think of our Redux state management. And from what I gather, it may be very similar to how XState works. So I'm really interested to see what he talks about there. So then after that, there is server-side rendering, which is important for a number of reasons. So first one being performance, and because the UI is rendered on the server and then delivered to the client. And then as a result of that performance, it also impacts SEO. So even though Google can render our JavaScript and see what the content has, they use performance as a key indicator of the ranking algorithm. So it affects SEO as well. And there's a third thing that's interesting, which may or may not matter to you, but to some sites it does, which is SMO, which is social media optimization. So whenever you share a link on Twitter or in Slack, and you get those rich previews of thumbnails and descriptions and stuff, that's SMO, and that was rendered server-side for them to grab that information. So a React provides methods to be able to render server-side. So there are a number of different ways to accomplish this, and it all depends on how your data is set up. So Gatsby is a static site generator, so it generates all the data up front at build time and creates all the pages for you. So if you don't have dynamic data and you just have a marketing site or a blog like mine, you can use Gatsby for that. On the other hand, it's Next.js, which is like a full framework. So if you have a database and you have dynamic data, then really Next is a good solution for that. So it's the opposite side of the coin, although they're now enabling you to have sections of your routes that are static, like a marketing section or marketing landing pages, for instance. You could build those at build time so that they're pre-processed, so you can have like a hybrid app. And then if you don't want to use any of those, you can just roll your own thing using Node. And Razzle is just a series of helper libraries that kind of facilitate server-side rendering. And it's actually UI agnostic as well, so it works with Vue and other libraries. But if you're in a situation where your backend is not in Node, and it's Django or Rails or .NET or PHP, you can't render your components in that framework. So we had that problem at Eventbrite, which is where I worked before Stitch Fix. And I gave a talk now 2 years ago about how we solved that problem. So if you have that problem, you could totally check out that video. And then lastly, I want to give a shout out to Allison, who's going to be giving us intro to Next, so we can kind of find out how that will work if you're interested in server-side rendering, happening later today. Okay, so that was a lot. And I want to give a quick recap because, honestly, you probably didn't catch all of those things. Maybe you took a 5-minute nap because I made you do squats, or maybe you're on Slack or text, whatever the reasons, I wanted to give a recap. So here are the 8 different suggestions. We have React, learn that really well, especially hooks because they're the future. Use Create React App for tooling, but you can eject whenever necessary. For styling, probably go with component CSS to start with, but then you can use Emotion for CSS and JS. For SPAs, Reach Router for routing. I use the native Fetch API. For forms, React Final Form is a good solution, but you can also use Formic, that works as well, but React Final Form. For testing, I would use React Testing Library for your testing needs, but you may want to use Cypress for a couple of Happy Path browser-based testing. And then for app data, try to just use React. Try to just use context and hooks. But then if your data really requires it, then you can reach for Redux, and then you'll be using it for what it's needed for. And then finally, server-side rendering, try out Next. Okay, so that's it. I just flooded you with a whole bunch of information. Like I said, the slides are online, so you could check those out. hopefully you got 1 or 2 or 7 different things that you learned about, and you got lots of notes that you can follow up on later. I wanted to thank Gray and the rest of the organizers for inviting me to share my knowledge and experience with all of you, and also for all of you for humoring me in the squats, but then also paying attention throughout the talk. So I won't be taking any questions up here, but if you have any questions, I'll be around throughout the day. I'll be going to the after party afterwards, so you can ask me questions there. Or if you're like an introvert like I am and you would never go up and ask somebody a question in person, you can reach out to me on Twitter as well, Ben MVP. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the conference.